stay where you are. I'm going to, here we go. All right, I have to adjust my view. Now, we're probably going to be hiding you during this talk. So if you need to be, well, just so you know that's happening now. Greetings, one and all. I believe we are effectively and actually streaming live to YouTube, which might be a very first for Spirituality in Practice. It is my pleasure as the new executive director to be the guinea pig to see if this experiment will in fact work. So if you're just tuning in, logging in, checking this out, what's happening is that I am doing a Zoom presentation that is being streamed live to YouTube, which means wherever people are in the world, if they've got a computer and a Wi-Fi signal, they can check this out. Now, we will have transcripts of this available afterwards, as well as a recording, which will naturally post here on our YouTube page, but I'm sure we can make it available if you send us a note. In fact, I think it'll be in today's email. Well, I have had an incredible time getting to know some of the people in the Spirituality and Practice community. Many people who are checking out this video right now are people who have been following the work of Frederick and Marianne Brusset for years. Maybe you've read Spiritual Literacy, maybe you've taken a course at Spirituality and Practice. And for all of our friends, we say thank you. Now, because we are out there floating in the ethers of the world right now, I got to put on my timer there. We also have to say welcome to people who have never even heard of us before. So we hope that after this talk or during this talk, you'll take a moment to check out spiritualityandpractice.com and be sure to explore. That is the essence of our site. We have tens of thousands of pages of content, hundreds of courses and classes. There are all kinds of resources for the spiritual journey, and you really only need to take some time to look. So whether it's film reviews, book reviews, commentaries about life and society, spiritual practices, you name it, it's probably there. So today, my intention is first of all just to have a chance to speak a little bit to our community and to people interested in spirituality and practice. And the intention of today's talk is also to take some time to reflect a little bit about our own spiritual journeys and where we are at on that path. And in light of that, to take the same kind of step back and look at perhaps our spiritual communities, like where are we nourished and what are we seeing going on in those communities? And what about our greater communities, our cities, our societies, or even our human population? I think one of the things that is significant as a context for this little talk is what we've experienced in the last couple of years. And I think that it's been a dramatic time for a lot of us in an internal kind of way. I think it's been surprising. I think more than anything, the last couple of years have been surprising for a lot of us on the spiritual path. And I say that because many of you, if you're interested in personal growth, spiritual growth, transformation, healing, religion, and so on, well, then you probably are surrounded by a fair number of people that think like you. And yet, what we've seen so much of is division. And I think that it's been surprising to see the nuances of division that exist in the world today. I think we've seen division not only between obvious lines, division between parties and cultures and even races, but then we've even seen division within those groups. And it's curious to contemplate the role of division on the spiritual journey. Is it natural? Is it unnatural? Should it be overcome? Should it be just embraced and understood? So our talk today is going to examine some of these themes, and I'm going to kind of toggle between having some slides up and then myself being up. Ultimately, we're kind of reflecting on what is the nature of evolution: personal, spiritual, communal. To illustrate this, I would like to tell you just a little story about a moment in my life where the insight that I hope to explore, or that I'm going to explore with you today, really, really struck me. So, about 20 years ago now, I was the director of spiritual care services for a large inner city hospital. Now, I appreciate there may even be some people watching this who were there back then or got involved. So I'm not going to name any names, and I don't mean to offend anybody with any of my stories. But when I started work in this department, one of the first things that struck me, once I kind of took the job and got beyond the enthusiasm of working with this incredible band of spiritual providers. Many of them were trained in interfaith work. Some of them were congregational leaders. Some of them were ministers or priests or rabbis in their own field. But we had a substantial team that we drew from to visit people in the hospital, and then also to provide, rituals and rites for their own community members. Well, as I say, I was really honored to take this position and really inspired by the kinds of people that I was going to be working with. And yet, one of the first things that I encountered was division. In fact, there were some people on my team who not only didn't like each other, but wouldn't even really talk to each other. Now, think about this. And I know from our community, some of you can relate. We probably have some chaplains listening. We probably have some therapists listening. So imagine here we are in this big inner city hospital, early morning prayer meetings. We would sit down in that chapel there, and it was a chance to, pass out the prayers that we received from the hospital. We would each, take turn saying a prayer for those people. We could also offer prayers for ourselves. And yet, almost like out of a sitcom, as we took our seats, you could see this one didn't want to sit beside this one. And this one, didn't want to be close to that one. And this one would roll their eyes when the other one got their prayer, right? I can see some of you chuckling. And I kept thinking, wait a second, are we sitting here praying for the whole world and everyone in this hospital, and then special blessings for this person and that person? But we don't want to talk to each other. We don't want to rub elbows with each other. And then we'd finish the prayers, everyone holy, everyone sacred, and then boom, off to the units, right? Well, that was a shocking lesson for me. And I wasn't sure I totally understood it. But there's more to the story, because by an incredible coincidence, at the same time in my life, I was teaching a meditation class at a local yoga studio. And so I would teach, people were seated. Most of the people were seated on the floor. We were in one of the yoga studios. And then usually at the end of the meditation, wasn't a very long class, but at the end of the meditation, I would do a little teaching. In the Buddhist tradition, they would call that like a Dharma talk or something like a sermon, right? But just short. So we'd finish our meditation, was only, maybe 10 minutes of warm up and instruction and breathing. And then, I don't know, I think maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes of sitting, and then another 10 minutes of some talking, something like that. Well, as we would conclude, and you have to imagine this room, people just like you, seated in their cushion, maybe after a long day of work, finally feeling relaxed, finally feeling present. And there at the door of the studio, faces, yoga mats pressed up. And we would, sometimes we'd be just like a couple minutes late. Maybe we're supposed to finish at 1/4 to the hour. We'd finish at 10 to the hour. And I'll tell you, as soon as we went to that door, it was like a stampede. The yoga students would come in and those yoga mats were going down, and it was like we weren't even there. They were all eager to get their first spot in line and closer to the front and close to the teacher, because damn it, I'm going to learn to be relaxed and kind and peaceful. Get the heck out of my way. And I was like, what? What's going on? We actually even had one time when one of the yoga students came in our class because we were 2 minutes over and started setting up her mat. And I thought, what the heck is going on? Here we are, right? Meditation, peace and love. And there they are, yoga, peace and love. And yet all I'm getting is like, get out of my way. I'm on the clock. You're in my seat. Well, there's one final part of this story. And it actually did all happen at the same time, which is that at that same moment, I was invited to sit on the ethics team of this hospital. And I was actually the only spiritual care representative, and everyone else were, there were physicians and there was a geneticist and someone from a senior position in nursing. And we were talking about the ethics, of decision-making in the hospital. We would have certain problems brought to us. We would have certain questions, sometimes leadership decisions, sometimes complaints. And what I noticed is that no one in that room wore a hat that said they were, quote, spiritual. No one in that room had a job or a title that labeled them as spiritual. In fact, most of them had careers that were quite scientifically oriented, evidence-based. And yet, wow, I'm just remembering, I just had a flashback. I'm remembering a particular fellow, Joe Cofford. I don't mind naming him because he was the epitome of what I want to talk about right now, which is this man was so much more like a sage, a saint, a compassionate caregiver than probably anyone that I was experiencing in those settings of meditation and yoga and chaplaincy and prayer. And he was, quote, just a physician. And so the thing that really struck me is that our interests and our roles and our titles don't necessarily define our consciousness. So I invite you to take a breath, if you will. Feel yourself settling in a little bit to the themes that we're exploring. As we start to question, I invite you to question with me, what the heck is going on? What is this thing called the spiritual life? What is this thing called the spiritual world? And how do we understand these connections and divisions between people, between faiths? I share the story of these really poignant interfaith settings where there was anything but a lack of spirituality at times. And yet, as I examined it, as I reflected on it, as I held it in kind of a contemplative way, what it revealed to me was an important teaching, a kind of spiritual lesson, if you will, which is that the world is organized, that there are patterns, and that it's very difficult to see those when you're caught up in the moment, when we're caught up in our reactions, when we're caught up in our disciplines, our preferences, what we're expecting people to do or what we're expecting to see, what we want. But instead, if we step back and simply engage what we have, what's before us, what's unfolding, from a witnessing mind, from an open heart, then we start to see, kind of like the image, if you're looking at the screen, that just like a tree, it's anything but random. There are certain ways that trees work, and there are certain ways that trees don't. And there are recurring patterns from the roots to the branches to the leaves themselves. There is order and organization in our universe everywhere. And no one discipline has dominion over that order, whether it's science or spirituality. To get a little more clear about this, what we start to realize is that, there's a famous quotation, and God darn it if I can't remember who said it. I'm sure some of you know that there's a saying by a great physicist: the world is not made up of atoms, it is made up of stories. And certainly that's not going to be a new idea to a lot of you. This idea that we are not so much dealing with facts in any moment as we are dealing with our relationship to facts. So there's a path for each of us. My way to life, my way to the future, my way of believing, my relationship with God, my idea of the soul. We have different belief lines that run through our faiths, our cultures, our traditions. And so that means you can absolutely identify differences between Catholic and Anglican or Orthodox Jews and Reform Jews, between Pure Land Buddhism and Zen Buddhism, particularly for those of us interested in the world of interfaith dialogue and interfaith study. We're very much aware there are different belief lines in this world. And yet, we sometimes become compelled or confused by the question as to whether we are really all going in the same direction as you see these arrows are converging, or maybe that's just something we want to believe. So any one of these arrows that you're seeing in the screen could represent what I'm going to call a belief line. Now, the words I'm using today, it's just my, phrasing, my vernacular. You don't need to use these if you want to think about this in your own way or your own tradition. But what I want to be clear with this image that you're seeing right now is that a belief line is maybe another way of describing a belief group, right? A grouping or a belief style or a community, right? So that's why you can see it as faith, culture, or tradition. Now, if you're looking at the screen, you'll notice that we have Taoist symbols and the Jewish menorah and the Buddhist, an image of a Buddha, and so on. We have the cross, but we also I have the sort of cliche social symbol for feminism, cliche, as well as the cliche symbolism for science, a microscope. And what I want you to consider, though, is that while the interfaith world has particularly focused on religious traditions, right? The great religions of the world and how they dialogue and interrelate, you might challenge any dialogue of faith to perhaps contain or address a broader spectrum of belief lines. In other words, there are many ways to organize our faith, and it's not all by faith tradition. Does that make sense? In other words, if you are exploring your relationship to God, to spirit, to soul, if religion is your container, just remember religion might not be the container for someone else. Science might be, a political movement might be, a social movement might be, and yet those things can provide all the same structure, philosophy, ritual, and community that any faith might. We saw a lot of that, I think, becoming clear if you were paying attention to the news and so on in the last couple of years. And yet, if we can agree that there are these different faith communities, different cultural communities, different traditions, belief lines, then why is it that in some ways they seem so different and so opposed, and in some ways they seem so much the same? Well, I think that's because every one of these belief lines really exists as a spectrum. And when I say a spectrum, I mean that every belief group, every faith group, every culture group naturally divides into at least three subcategories. Although depending on the category that you're in, you might say they're all moving towards a relationship with the same great mystery, with God, with love, with the exploration of the mysteries of our universe. So let's take another step here. Oh, and of course, you may keep in mind your own experiences as you think about this historically. You may consider a little bit about what you're seeing outside your window these days. But it's important to think about these belief lines, both in terms of groups, but also in terms of self. So, what are the three different lines that we see? Now, I'm going to pause just for a second because it's nice to come back to the big group and have my face large for a second so you're not just staring at a screen. Well, what my story at the beginning kind of illustrates is that even if a group's mission or message is unity, some people will get that. And some people will be working towards it. Some people will get that and they will use that as a vehicle to build bridges and invite others in. And others will take the same movement, and that might be Kabbalah, that might be I was trying to think of an esoteric a Christian practice. It could be the practices of Saint Ignatius of Loyola. It could be a Taoist practice. It could be Sufism. It could be an explicitly mystical, compassionate path. And yet, if you've hung out long enough around other seekers like yourself, you'll see that there's something that isn't the same, even though you're all sitting in the same room. You're all talking about the same things, and you're all, in theory, moving towards the same future. So what is that division that we see? Well, I like to think of this as a dynamic of three. That at one level, in every group that you could ever be a part of, every belief line, you will always find those that are intra-culturally focused. Now, intra meaning internal to itself. So whether it's Christianity, whether it's Taoism, whether it's Hinduism, or more specifically Jainism or science, we start to see the world through that lens only. Okay? And that's where we begin to see division. That's where you start to hear, well, wait a second, don't say Christian because Anglican's not the same as Methodist. Methodist's not the same as Lutheran. Lutheran's not the same as Seventh-day Adventist. Oh, they're not even really Christian. What about these people? Oh, they're not really Christian, right? We can find that division. And the same in science. Well, you could listen to him, but he's just an anesthesiologist. Well, you could listen to her, but she's just an oral surgeon. We find this kind of thinking and language of division throughout all the communities. And so the intracultural impulse is universal. Again, to be clear, the feeling that your belief is the right one. In some extremes, the only one. Of course, we also find there are intercultural relationships to belief, which means I have my belief and it's okay for you to have yours. Okay, so I acknowledge there are more than one faiths in the room. I just have mine, you have yours, that's fine. And within the intercultural, just as in the intracultural, there are gradients. So at the threshold of the intercultural, we find tolerance. But as we go deeper into the intercultural, we find dialogue. And yet, what has inspired me is that in every faith community, every belief community, every cultural community, there are also those whose relationship to the culture and faith itself transcends the culture and the faith itself. And what do we mean by that? Well, in the transcultural perspective or attitude or relationship to belief, we not only know that there are others out there, we are not only open to dialogue and learning, but we ultimately understand a kind of unity, a kind of harmony, a kind of sameness that lives at the heart within all those belief lines. The transcultural relationship to our tradition or faith or work or belief is one that knows that the philosophy and the rituals are only vehicles to something that ultimately transcends the philosophy and the ritual. And that is why I call it transcultural. And in many cases, this is what we relate to as mysticism, the direct experience of the ultimate nature of reality, the experience that transcends form and format, the experience that transcends stage of life, age of life, or any exterior construction. Now, here's where things get a little bit fun. So first of all, I should clarify, I'm going to add a few more words here. There are a lot of ways you can interpret these three levels. So of course, the intracultural level can be intrafaith, which is sort of like the home well, it's certainly the home of extremists. It's the home, in some cases, of the Orthodox. In some cases, it's the home of those who would say that there's simply only one way. And then we have this intercultural level, which is a substantial, I would say, grouping on our planet. I'd say probably more people are interfaith than we realize. But that interfaith, intercultural level is the place where we're passionate about our belief, but we're open to those of others. And then finally, we might say there's a trans-faith place. Now, to give you an example of some of these things, let's put up some language here that's going to help you clarify what these things mean. Now, I see some people might be making notes. I'll put that slide up in a second, but I want to give you some examples just to clarify what these three things might look like. When I think about a religious leader or teacher like the Dalai Lama, or like Bishop Desmond Tutu, or the late Zalman Schachter, I think specifically of people who are absolutely rooted in a belief line, right? They represent a tradition. They're a religious leader. In most of these cases, they even dress the part. So they are absolutely defined by a belief line. And yet, when I say those three names, if you know one or any of them, then you immediately know that these are transcultural, trans faith. These are people that have certainly been featured in a tremendous amount of interfaith dialogue, but what enables them to be in that dialogue, we know, is their transcultural vision, that there's something in their consciousness that is really mystical. And by that, I mean, is so connected to our source, to God, to spirit, that love comes first before being right, before being righteous, before imposing belief or expectations on another. So that's a really interesting example of how that model works. You can say, there is someone who has a belief-specific life and lifestyle, but their consciousness transcends it all. And I think that we all kind of hope for that in our politics too, that we can find politicians, regardless of our field or our allegiance, that thinks for the whole group and not only their group. But we can also find this kind of breakdown in communities that are specifically mystically oriented, transculturally oriented, or interfaith oriented. So, for example, you might go to a Zen Buddhist temple. In fact, I know a number of Zen Buddhist priests, and most of them are rather transcultural, right, beyond interfaith in their approach. And yet, I've had some confront me to say, well, why are you busy doing all this interfaith stuff when you know it's all about oneness? It's all about non-duality. You really should have been a Zen teacher. You should have been a Zen priest. And I'm like, wait a second. Are you actually being a fundamentalist about inclusivity? And yes, I think some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. Anger for people not being inclusive, judgment for people not being like us. And so we find this kind of irony. I believe in peace and love, except for people who don't believe in peace and love. What? How's that going to get us anywhere? And so in the same way, we can look to the belief lines, and I'll go back to that slide for you now, and we can see that whatever the line is, it could be feminism, it could be humanism, atheism, science. In fact, it can even be simple professional divisions, right? If you think that your way is the answer to everyone's problems or the one answer that everyone needs, then probably that's a intra-faith, right? Intracultural fundamentalist view. And that could even be like a guy like me saying, nope, this 3-level approach is the only approach, right? You may have studied a lot of things in your interfaith pursuits, but this is what you need to know. And if you didn't like this, then you don't get it, right? So judgment, exclusivity, againstness, fear, control, constriction, conservation, protectionism, evangelism, these are all the words of that first level of development. Now, it's interesting to note that this phenomena not only occurs in groups, that there will always be people in any group who feel that their group is the best group, but we discover that this is a pattern in our personal lives, and it happens in many ways. So one way that this happens, that we become focused on this first level of thinking, is that something's new to us. Okay, and so when we have a more adolescent, you might say, or amateur sort of relationship to something, let's say we're learning to golf, or we're learning to bake, or we're learning to knit, someone might say to us, this is how you do it. So you learn. That's how you hit a golf ball. That's how you cross stitch. That's how you bake. And when you're beginning, there's fear. There's fear of getting it wrong. There's a desire to get it right. It's not all terrible stuff. But then we can become kind of attached to it, right? Well, that's not how you swing a bat. That's not how you bake a cake. But you find that someone who's been doing it for longer than you might have a different perspective. And they might say, oh, yeah, well, I understand you're used to using white flour, but I've been experimenting with different flours and I can get cakes that taste differently. Well, for the fundamentalist baker that's still learning, what? You can use different flours in the same recipe? Shocking. And this is a little bit like moving out of our faith group into an interfaith dialogue. There are other ways to do it. But the intercultural or interfaith level, the second level of our development, is not a stopping point. It's just really the beginning of a transformation that we're all capable of. We start to relax and realize that what we've become passionate about, what we've become identified with, what we've become attached to is actually only one way of doing things. And we are rapidly approaching 8 billion people on this planet. And that means that right now, as you hear these words, there are almost 8 billion opinions about what God is, about what matters in life, about how you get dressed in the morning, or what's best to eat at night, or how you prepare a cup of coffee. 8 billion perspectives. And yet we get attached to one. It's kind of remarkable. In the interfaith movement of our lives and of our communities, we begin to open to dialogue. And dialogue is an incredible and important step, an incredible and important bridge as we begin to learn from each other. We begin to see that maybe what another tradition has to offer could somehow inform me or inspire me. When I worked in that hospital I told you about earlier, I remember we had a Catholic nun who used to come visit, and she was also a practitioner of Buddhist loving kindness meditation. So here she was in a clearly defined belief line, and yet her interfaith studies opened her to tools and practices that enriched her in a way that she hadn't found in her own tradition. So this is one of the beauties and the values of the interfaith dimension of community or self, which is we start to discover that there are aspects in our own journey, our own community, that maybe haven't been covered or aren't represented or have been forgotten. And through each other, we can remember the fullness of faith, the fullness of life, or the fullness even of a profession or a relationship. So the interfaith level, that second level, is about tolerance, curiosity, dialogue, openness, sharing, cooperation, and building bridges. Now, I want to be clear that not one of these levels is ever entirely always the right level. In fact, to ever think that is to start to forget what we're talking about. In other words, you might be listening to this suddenly thinking, oh yeah, intracultural's bad, interfaith is good. That's not really the intention. It's to recognize how quickly the mind tries to set up judgment, opposition, and control. In the intracultural or that intrafaith approach, there are some values, right? Conservation of a tradition, of a language, of a ritual, of a practice can be a wonderful thing, right? Creating formats that are specialized for unique groups of people and meet unique needs, that's a wonderful thing. The problem is when it simply becomes the mindset rather than a temporary strategy or approach or way of handling a situation. So hopefully that's very, very clear that there can be a value in any level, but consciousness is ultimately what we're talking about. In the intercultural level, the same thing. We find this spectrum from tolerance to learning together, and yet there can be a kind of unspoken resistance to truly being vulnerable and setting down that which has defined us all our lives. That we find that we are talking to our neighbors, but still over the fence. We are talking to our neighbors, but maybe around a dinner table, and we still go to separate homes. And yet, when we move to the transcultural vision, we stay. We have one home. We have one dinner table. We have one community. And so the transcultural dimension of a group or of a stage of life or spiritual development is one in which we move into inclusivity, shared identity, mutuality, meaning your benefit is my benefit is your benefit, altruism, deep listening, wanting to know where others are coming from, why they're coming from that place, and more than just to learn, but to embrace and witness the sacredness that difference is. This is the level of love and surrender and advocacy. Now, many of you are familiar with this level. I'm aware of that, because you wouldn't really be hanging out with spirituality and practice, or you wouldn't be studying spiritual literacy and these sorts of things if you didn't have that sense. And the foundation of spiritual literacy itself, which is really the kind of the skeleton on which the entire spirituality and practice website is built. It's the, you might say, the heart of it. It comes from the knowing that life itself is a spiritual experience, that God is available to us in all things, in all moments. And so we can use things like the spiritual alphabet to awaken to the presence of spirit in all things. In fact, in every belief line, we find that there are what I would call mystical practices, mystical Judaism, mystical Buddhism, mystical Islam, even mystical science, even mystical advocacy, all these sorts of things. There's always going to be the persistence of those who consciously, unconsciously, intentionally or unintentionally, awaken to the unity of things. And so they use those pathways, those mystical channels, like spiritual literacy is a great example, to awaken to the oneness of life, to move to a place of living beyond fear. Now, this isn't meant to diminish either the interfaith or intrafaith communities, but it is to say that maybe we're in a moment of history where it's time to think further, time to think forward, and time to get clear on the nuances of what communities and beliefs we're really investing in, that we're really a part of. I believe that a lot of people come to interfaith settings and dialogues, multi-faith settings and dialogues, because they have a transcultural heart. They have a mystical heart. And yet they want to know that mystical heart through their own tradition. Many people here who've studied with Cynthia Bourgeault, it's a great example of someone whose teachings is incredibly comparable, almost synonymous with some of the mystical and metaphysical teachings of other disciplines, and yet it comes from within a tradition. So we find that balance. And yet to live without that balance is truly not the same as knowing of these levels intellectually, but not living from them. And here's what I mean by that. If we look at the last 2 years of division, all kinds of division about masks, division about race, division about poverty, division about politics, division about, right, what is justice, so many things. We discover that even a compassionate and loving goal or vision can be pursued from any one of these 3 levels. That we can pursue justice and fairness and equality from a place that is angry and hateful. We can pursue justice and love and equality from a place that is curious and willing to dialogue. But we can also pursue justice and love and equality from a place that understands that absolutely every human being is working through these same struggles, these same big questions, this same longing for purpose and place and belonging, even those that might feel the misguided. More than a couple of years ago, when there was the big controversy around the Dakota pipeline, which was moving oil from Canada all the way down to, I guess, Texas. Many of you were aware of that controversy, and I was something like a congregational minister at the time, speaking for a spiritual community in Denver, the Althea community. And I was getting ready in the middle of the heat of it to do a Sunday talk about the pipeline. And it was interesting because a week before, when I posted what I was going to talk about, you can't believe the messages that I started to get. Emails from community members saying, well, whatever you do, I hope you don't come out with all this peace and love crap. Those people that are building those pipelines, they're nothing but evil. Don't even, right? Then I got other messages. Jonathan, I work for the oil and gas companies. I hope you're not going to get up on that stage and make us the bad guy. And everything in between, for this, against that. And the only way that I could really hold it was to say, we're going to have to look at all three levels of this situation. Why is it that some people feel that this pipeline is the only way, to run energy and economy into this country? I might not agree with it, but let's face it, some people are convinced of that. And there are people that are absolutely convinced that there's no place for that, and there never will be, and it needs to end as soon as possible. Then there's another place that says, let's dialogue. Let's have a negotiation, maybe legal, a debate. And then there's another place that says, can we find anything that we agree on? Anything. When we start from a place of just acknowledging that behind all these faceless corporations and different parties involved, we are talking about people with families, people with fear, people who want more and different, whether we agree with it or not. And if we're going to evolve a conversation, what's the most effective place to evolve it from? Somebody feeling that you're already against them, somebody feeling like you are tolerable, but needing of study, or someone who you welcome like family. It's something to consider. And as we look at this, and we're coming to the end of our time now, I really encourage you to question how you hold this in your own life. Are there relationships where your impulse is towards control and judgment? Are there relationships where you are open to connection, but only so much? And are there relationships where you're willing to really be present, surrendered, loving, willing to be curious and beyond even needing to know? Of course, at Spirituality in Practice, we believe that one of the great tools that we have available us to move through these levels is the practice of seeing life as a spiritual journey, that we can learn from every moment, that spiritual literacy and the alphabet of 37 practices really emerges out of a transcultural or trans-faith vision, a way of being in the world that ultimately draws from faith traditions and yet is beyond faith, even beyond interfaith. And yet, let us be vigilant. Let us be aware that any practice that liberates can contain, can constrict. You remember my joke about, well, it wasn't really a joke, but my story about the Zen Buddhist who was telling me that all my multi-faith work was wonderful and they knew I had a mystical heart, but really until I embraced Zen, I wasn't there yet. And so if you are looking at the screen and you see the red arrow, one of the human phenomena that we see is that anytime people make it to that mystical place of oneness and unity, it is so remarkably common to say, Eureka, I've got it. Oh, and you don't. And so the very vision that is about unity, that is about finding God in every place and spirit in all things, suddenly becomes held as an intra-cultural tool. And if you're not a Sufi, if you're not a Kabbalist, if you don't understand Taoism, if you aren't a part of the metaphysical movement, then you've got a long way to go. And we find that in the end, what this reflects is not so much the nature of spirit, but the nature of spirit as expressed through human beings. That this three-level split is just a part of the way we're made. And our responsibility as students of life, as students of spirit, is to stay aware of our consciousness, of where we're coming from in each conversation as we rise to meet each day. If we attempt to live life as a spiritual practice, if we seek to be spiritually literate, then we have to be honest with ourselves. One of my closing thoughts, and then I will have to say goodbye to all our friends on YouTube and wish you well. But one of my closing thoughts that I thought a little bit about is that I think that the the thing that we're starting to realize, the thing that I think this presentation is ultimately about, is that we're entering into a very new era in human history and philosophy and society. And for generations now, we have been divided by our belief lines, science versus religion, one religion versus another, one gender versus another, and so on. But I think that we're passing that time, and instead we're moving into an age where consciousness, not what you do, but how you do it, not what group you're in, but how you hold it. Consciousness itself is what is beginning to organize the world. And I encourage you, as the kind of person that would listen to this, to really ask yourself what that looks like in your life, whether it's in the small details of personal relationships or bigger choices about what you invest in, where you shop, what you spend time watching, what you encourage in others, what you stand for. Because ultimately, what we're seeing is that it isn't any one tradition that has created upheaval and division in the world. It is the consciousness of againstness. It's the consciousness of control, power over, attachment, division. This is the real pandemic. This is the real infection that we are all suffering from. And the remedy isn't any one tradition, but instead all traditions, all people willing to look at life through the layers and levels of consciousness, and not just the practices and communities that help us to feel safe. And so our time is up. I'm very, very grateful for all of you who've joined me, or if you're listening to this at a later time, that's fine too. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you'll explore spirituality and practice and all the incredible resources that we have for whatever aspect of the journey you're interested in or whatever stage of the process you're in. I'm going to be saying goodbye to our YouTubers. Thank you, YouTubers. Hopefully you had a good time. I did. And you're always welcome to reach out through our website.